Imagine living in a world where the cold is not just a discomfort, but a constant looming threat. The winter months stretch long, the nights seem endless, and the landscape is often covered in snow and ice. This is the world the Vikings knew, but how did these fierce warriors, explorers, and traders manage to thrive in such an unforgiving climate? In this video, we'll take a deep dive into how the ancient Vikings survived the harsh cold of the north. We'll explore how they built their homes, made their clothes, gathered and stored food, and most importantly, how the family worked together to stay alive. The first thing that comes to mind when you think of Viking survival is probably their homes, those iconic longhouses. But these weren't just structures to sleep in. Longhouses were the heart of Viking life, and their construction was a testament to the Vikings' ingenuity in adapting to their environment. Viking longhouses were a key part of Viking life and survival, providing shelter, warmth, and a space for family and community. Their construction was an incredible feat of craftsmanship and ingenuity, tailored to withstand the harsh Scandinavian climate. Let's dive into the details of how Viking longhouses were made, how long it took to build one, and the different techniques used in their construction. The primary material used for building Viking longhouses was timber, specifically oak and pine, which were abundant in the forests of Scandinavia. The wood was durable, strong, and ideal for construction in the cold, wet climate of the Viking lands. Large trees were felled, and the logs were split or shaved into planks for the walls, roof, and framework. Oak was commonly used for the structural beams, while pine and other softer woods were often used for the walls and interior features. For the roof, the Vikings used thatch made from straw or reeds, which was layered over wooden beams. In some cases, sod, thick grass and earth, was used to help insulate the roof, making it more efficient at keeping heat inside. Clay or moss were sometimes used as insulating materials between logs, helping to keep the interior warm in the harsh winter. This was especially important since Viking homes were heated by a central hearth, and the structure needed to retain as much warmth as possible. The Vikings used basic tools such as axes, adzes, and chisels to shape the logs and build the structure. They also used rudimentary hammers and wedges to split wood. While these tools may seem simple by today's standards, they were highly effective for the Vikings, who were skilled craftsmen. Of course, before construction began, the Vikings would carefully select a site for their longhouse. The site needed to be relatively flat and dry, ideally near a source of wood for construction, and in many cases close to water for fishing and transport. Villages were often built near the coast or rivers, as these areas provided easy access to the resources they needed for trade and sustenance. Once the site was selected, the ground was cleared of rocks, trees, and debris. The foundation of the longhouse typically consisted of large stones placed in a shallow trench around the perimeter. This helped anchor the structure and prevented it from sinking into the ground over time. In some cases, Viking longhouses were built on raised platforms or wooden beams to protect them from moisture and flooding, especially in areas with high water tables. With the site prepared, the skeleton of the longhouse was constructed from large vertical timbers, often oak, which served as the primary load-bearing elements. These vertical beams were carefully placed in the ground at regular intervals along the perimeter of the house. Horizontal beams were then used to connect the vertical posts, creating a strong, sturdy framework. The Vikings used a technique known as post and beam construction, which was common in ancient building practices. The beams were interlocked with notches and secured with wooden pegs or iron nails. The interlocking beams helped distribute the weight evenly, making the structure stable even in the face of harsh weather. Once the frame was in place, the walls were constructed by filling the gaps between the beams with split wood, clay, moss, or reeds. This added both insulation and stability to the structure. The walls were often built in a way that allowed them to flex slightly during windstorms, which helped prevent them from collapsing under pressure. The outer layer of the walls was typically covered in wooden planks or shingles to protect against rain and snow. The roof of a Viking longhouse was one of its most important features. It had a steep pitch, often nearly 45 degrees, designed to let snow and rain slide off easily. This was especially important in regions where heavy snowfalls could accumulate during the winter months. The roof was constructed with wooden beams and then thatched with reeds or straw. The thatch was layered thickly to provide insulation. The thick sod or moss could also be placed over the thatch, creating an additional layer of protection from the cold and helping to keep the heat in. The Vikings understood the importance of keeping the longhouse warm. Archaeological evidence shows that some longhouses also had a smoke hole at the top of the roof to allow smoke from the central hearth to escape. This was essential in preventing the house from filling with smoke and suffocating its inhabitants, especially during the long winter months when the fire was often burning all day. The hearth is where the family gathered for warmth, cooking, and socializing. It was usually located in the middle of the longhouse and was often surrounded by a circular stone or clay structure to help retain heat. The smoke from the fire would rise and escape through a chimney or vent in the roof. The hearth was more than just a source of warmth. It also served as a place for cooking and food preservation. Vikings would often hang meats and fish above the hearth to dry or smoke them, taking advantage of the warmth and smoke to preserve their food for the long winter months. The time it took to build a Viking longhouse varied depending on the size and resources available, but generally it could take anywhere from several weeks to several months. The construction process was intensive and required a skilled team of builders. Some of the tasks, such as felling trees and splitting logs, could be done in winter when the ground was frozen, making it easier to work in the forests. However, the actual building of the structure was typically done in spring or summer, when weather conditions were more favorable. For a large longhouse that would house an extended family or even multiple families, construction could take several months. Smaller, simpler longhouses designed for individual families might be completed in a shorter time. Viking longhouses weren't all identical. While the general structure and design was similar, there were regional variations in how they were built. For instance, in coastal areas, longhouses might have been slightly shorter but wider to accommodate fishing gear and maritime life, while inland longhouses could be longer, focusing more on storage for agricultural products. In some Viking settlements, especially in Norway, archaeologists have uncovered longhouses that were built into hillsides or used natural rock formations as part of the structure. These adaptations were made to take advantage of the terrain and to ensure the longhouse remained as insulated and sheltered as possible. By understanding the building techniques and materials the Vikings used, we gain insight into their ability to not just survive, but thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. It was the work of skilled craftsmen and cooperative communities that allowed these homes to endure for centuries, and that legacy continues to shape our understanding of Viking life today. Now let's talk about clothing. The Vikings lived in a land where winter could last up to 6 months, so their clothing was designed for one purpose: survival. But it wasn't just about bundling up. No, the Vikings had perfected the art of layering, using the natural materials available to them to create highly functional clothing. Wool was the most common material used for Viking clothing. The Vikings domesticated sheep, and wool was highly prized for its warmth, durability, and versatility. Archaeological finds, such as textile remnants discovered in Viking sites across Scandinavia, show that wool was woven into a variety of garments, from tunics to cloaks. Wool was an excellent insulator, keeping Vikings warm even in wet conditions, and its ability to wick away moisture was crucial for survival in the cold and damp climates. The wool was harvested by shearing the sheep in the spring. This was done by hand with simple knives or shears. The wool was then sorted to remove any unwanted debris or coarse fibers. The soft, fine wool was used for weaving, while the coarser wool was used for making outer garments like cloaks or even as padding. Linen, made from the flax plant, was another key material for Viking clothing, though less common than wool. Linen was typically used for undergarments, like shirts or trousers, and was valued for being lighter and cooler than wool. The Vikings did not have the technology to spin linen as finely as we do today, so it was often woven into coarser, thicker fabrics. Flax plants were grown by the Vikings, who would harvest the plants, pull them from the ground, and process them to extract the fibers. The fibers were then spun into thread using a spindle. Flax was relatively easy to cultivate in the northern climates and had multiple uses beyond clothing, including for making ropes and sails. The Vikings also relied heavily on animal furs and hides for their outer garments, particularly in the coldest months. Fur-lined cloaks, gloves, hats, and boots were all common. These materials provided excellent protection against the wind and cold. Animals like reindeer, elk, wolves, and bears were hunted for their fur and skins. The skins were carefully preserved through tanning or smoking. The Vikings had a deep understanding of animal anatomy and used every part of the animal from meat to fur to bone in their daily life. The skins were softened and prepared with a combination of smoke and oil, often from animal fat, to create durable, waterproof leather. Vikings who lived near the coast or traveled in longships often used the hides from seals and other marine mammals. Seal skins, for example, were particularly valuable for making waterproof garments, which were vital for Viking sailors and fishermen. This technique was especially important for Vikings living in Norway and Iceland, where the cold and wet conditions made waterproof gear essential. The sinew from animals was another key material, especially for the Vikings when it came to stitching leather and fur together. Animal sinew, or tendon fibers, were incredibly strong, making them perfect for sewing together thicker materials such as leather and heavy furs. The Vikings had a variety of tools at their disposal to make clothing. These tools were often crafted by hand, and their efficiency depended on the Vikings' skill and knowledge. To turn wool and flax into thread, the Vikings used spindles and distaffs. The spindle was a simple, handheld tool, often made of wood or bone, used for spinning fibers into yarn. The distaff was a device used to hold the wool or flax fibers as the spinner twisted them into threads. Women and children primarily performed this task, as it was an essential part of textile production in Viking households. Once the wool was sheared and cleaned, it was spun into yarn using a spindle. The spinning process involved twisting the fibers together to create a continuous thread. The thickness and consistency of the yarn were important for ensuring the fabric was durable and functional. Once the thread was spun, it was woven into fabric using a loom. Looms from the Viking Age were relatively simple, hand-powered devices, often made from wood. The loom was used to interlace threads, either wool or flax, into textiles. The basic design involved a horizontal or vertical frame where threads were strung tightly, and the weaver would pass a shuttle with the weft thread between the vertical threads to create a woven fabric. Vikings typically used simple weaves, such as plain weave and twill weave. The plain weave was the most common, where each thread passed alternately over and under the threads that ran in the opposite direction. The twill weave was used for heavier, thicker fabrics that could be used for outer garments. To sew together garments, the Vikings used needles made from bone, wood, or metal, with an eye to hold the thread. Bone needles were particularly common and were often decorated or carved with intricate designs. These needles were essential for hand sewing the pieces of clothing together. Vikings used a simple yet effective running stitch technique to sew their garments together. For heavier materials like leather or fur, they used sinew, animal tendons, which provided extra strength and durability. The stitches were carefully crafted to ensure that the garments would hold together through the rigors of daily life and the harsh weather conditions. For leather and fur processing, Vikings used rudimentary tanning tools. Animal skins were first scraped clean of fat and flesh using knives, then softened using a mixture of water, tannins from tree bark, and oils. The process of tanning was essential for preserving the hides and turning them into durable materials for making shoes, cloaks, and belts. The Vikings' ability to weave and spin wool and flax into fabric was an integral part of their clothing production. The spinning process, done with a spindle, would create thread that could be woven into fabrics of varying thicknesses. These fabrics were then dyed using plant-based dyes such as woad, madder, and lichen. Natural dyes were used to color their wool and linen garments. The color palette was often limited to earthy tones, reds, yellows, and browns, though brighter colors were sometimes achieved with more complex techniques. The Vikings would gather plant materials like berries, roots, and leaves, boil them to extract dyes, and then soak the fabrics in these natural concoctions. Viking clothing was designed to be layered for warmth and flexibility. The first layer, typically made of linen or wool, was worn directly on the skin. Over this, a woolen tunic or dress might be worn. For outerwear, Viking men and women would wear cloaks made from wool or fur, fastened with brooches. The use of layers was especially important in colder regions where the temperatures could drop below freezing. While their clothing was primarily functional, it was not without embellishment. Brooches, belts, and clasps made from metal, bone, or wood were used to fasten cloaks or tunics. Some clothing was decorated with intricate embroidery, especially for those in higher social classes. Embroidery was used not only for decoration but also as a means of showing social status. Wealthier Vikings would wear garments made of finer wool, while poorer Vikings wore simpler, coarser materials. Fur-lined cloaks were typically reserved for the wealthy and elite, while simpler wool tunics were common for the average Viking. In addition, the skill of textile production was often a sign of wealth and status. Viking women in particular were highly skilled in weaving and sewing, and their ability to produce high-quality textiles was crucial to the household's success and the family's reputation within the community. Aside from sturdy dwellings and insulated clothing, food was perhaps their most important resource. Without a reliable supply of food, survival in the harsh winters would have been impossible. But how did they gather and store enough food to last through the long winter months? Let's start with hunting. The Vikings, known for their seafaring and raiding, were also highly skilled hunters, capable of surviving and thriving in the harsh winter climates of Scandinavia. Their hunting methods, tools, and ability to track game through the cold and snow played a crucial role in their survival. During the long and brutal winters, when the land was blanketed in snow and the days were short, hunting remained a vital part of daily life. In the winter months, when snow covered the ground, the Vikings would have used their skills in tracking animals across the snow-covered landscape. Whether hunting large animals like reindeer or smaller game like hares and foxes, tracking was a critical skill. The Vikings would read the signs left by animals, footprints, broken branches, or the presence of fresh droppings. This required both patience and experience, as the Vikings needed to identify which animals had passed through an area recently. Their hunting grounds included forests, open plains, and coastal regions. While they might have used spears or bows when hunting on foot, in forests or on open land, they also used dogs to help track and corner animals. Reindeer and elk, which were abundant in Scandinavian forests, were hunted by chasing them into more open areas where the Vikings could encircle them. In addition to hunting on land, Vikings also hunted in the icy waters. In rivers and lakes that froze over in winter, the Vikings practiced ice fishing. They would cut holes in the ice and set up nets or fish traps to catch fish like pike, perch, and herring. This method allowed them to catch food during the months when traditional hunting was difficult. Excavations of Viking settlements such as Lindholm Høje in Denmark and Hedeby reveal evidence of ice fishing tools including harpoons and fish hooks used by the Vikings. The remains of fish bones found at these sites show that fishing was an integral part of their diet, especially in winter, when hunting on land was more challenging. Some hunting methods involved hunting at night. The hunters, who would have been accustomed to long, dark winters, likely hunted at night using torches or simple lanterns made of animal fat and wood. These light sources would have been used to attract nocturnal animals or to help them spot animals that might be otherwise difficult to track in the dark. The spear was perhaps the most iconic hunting tool of the Vikings, and it was used extensively in the winter months. Vikings employed a range of spears, from throwing spears to heavier thrusting spears, depending on the type of prey they were targeting. These spears were typically made from wood, with sharp iron or steel tips. Excavations of Viking-era sites, such as those at Birka in Sweden, have uncovered a large number of spearheads, confirming that spears were a primary hunting tool. The spears were generally about 2 to 3 meters long, giving the hunter a reach that allowed them to strike at large game from a safe distance. While the Vikings are more commonly known for their use of swords and axes in battle, they were also adept archers. Bows and arrows were used in hunting for smaller game such as birds, hares, and deer. The bows were typically made from yew, ash, or elm, and they were capable of shooting arrows with great force. Viking graves, such as those at Viking Age graves in Hedeby, modern-day Germany, have yielded arrowheads made of iron and bone. These arrowheads, sometimes barbed, suggest they were not just used in warfare but also in hunting, with arrows tailored for piercing animal hide. Vikings also relied on traps to catch animals during the winter months when it was difficult to hunt in deep snow. These traps were used to capture smaller animals like rabbits, foxes, and even birds. Traps would have been placed along game trails or near den sites. They used various methods for trapping, including snares and pit traps. Archaeological sites, such as those found in Lofoten, Norway, have provided evidence of bone and wooden traps, suggesting that the Vikings had a well-developed system of capturing smaller prey. These traps were essential during the winter, as hunting larger game in the snow could be difficult. Viking settlements often had dogs that were used for tracking and hunting. Dogs were trained to assist in hunting by chasing prey into traps or by retrieving the animals once they were shot or speared. The hunting dogs were likely similar to the Nordic sled dogs and Spitz breeds, known for their endurance and ability to work in harsh conditions. Reindeer were one of the most important game animals, especially in northern and inland regions. These large herbivores provided meat, fur, and hides, which were used for clothing, shelters, and even weapons. Reindeer were particularly significant during the long winters when other food sources were scarce. Elk, also known as moose, were another key animal in the Viking diet. These large mammals provided substantial amounts of meat, and their fur and antlers were used for a variety of purposes, including making tools and weapons. Evidence of elk hunting can be seen in the remains found at Viking settlement sites such as Lofoten and Söderby. Bones and antlers from elk have been uncovered, indicating that these animals were a prized source of food and materials. In Viking burials and settlements, remains of foxes, wolves, and other small mammals have been discovered. These animals were likely trapped using snares or pit traps, as indicated by findings of bones with signs of trapping injuries. Bird hunting was common, especially for species like geese, ducks, and swans. These birds provided essential protein and were especially valuable in winter, when other food sources were scarce. Bird bones, particularly from waterfowl, have been found in Viking settlements. The remains of these birds suggest that Vikings hunted them both on the ground and from water. For those living along the coasts, seals were a vital resource. Seal hunting, especially in the colder months, provided the Vikings with meat, oil, and furs, which were invaluable for keeping warm during long winters. Settlements along the northern and western coasts of Scandinavia, like those at Lofoten and Iceland, have yielded abundant remains of seals. This suggests that seals were an important part of the hunting economy in coastal regions. But it wasn't all about meat. They were also adept at foraging for wild plants. Archaeological studies have uncovered evidence of Viking diets that included wild berries, herbs, and even edible roots. Juniper, thyme, and nettles were commonly gathered for their medicinal and nutritional properties. These wild plants were used not only in cooking, but for their health benefits. Most settlements had specialized herb gardens, often planted with medicinal herbs that could be used to treat illnesses. The herbs helped them combat diseases and infections, which were common in the harsh climate. During the late summer and fall, the Vikings foraged a variety of wild berries and fruits, which were vital for their diet during the winter months. These could be eaten fresh or preserved. Bilberries were plentiful in the forests of Scandinavia and were gathered in late summer and early fall. Crowberries are another common berry in the Nordic landscape. They grow in the wild and were often collected in late summer. Lingonberries were often found in forests and wetlands. Cloudberries, which grow in marshy, boggy areas, were highly prized by the Vikings. Known for their unique tart flavor, they were collected in late summer. Nuts and seeds were important for providing fats and protein, essential for survival during the long winters. Hazelnuts were abundant, especially in forested areas. These nuts were collected in the autumn, where they were either eaten raw, roasted, or preserved for use in winter. While not as commonly consumed as hazelnuts, acorns were sometimes gathered and processed by the Vikings. These nuts were rich in carbohydrates, but needed to be leached of tannins to make them edible. Roots and tubers were essential for the Vikings during the winter, especially when other food sources were scarce. These underground plants could survive through the cold months and were a vital part of their winter diet. While wild carrots were smaller and less sweet than the cultivated varieties we know today, they were gathered in late summer and fall. The roots could be eaten raw, boiled, or dried for preservation. The stinging nettle, known for its medicinal properties, also had edible roots. Vikings would gather these roots in early spring and autumn, using them as a food source when other vegetables were in short supply. Cress and sorrel could be eaten fresh in salads or dried and stored for use in soups and stews during the winter. Both of these greens grew in the wild and were gathered for their high vitamin content. Mushrooms, though seasonal, were an important food source when available. The Vikings foraged for edible mushrooms which provided protein and essential nutrients. Golden chanterelle mushrooms were often found in the forests of Scandinavia and would be harvested during the late summer months. They were cooked fresh or dried for later use. Various types of boletes and other mushrooms grew in the forests and were considered a valuable food source, especially in the autumn. Foraging during the winter months required a different set of strategies and techniques compared to the warmer seasons. The Vikings had to rely on their deep knowledge of the land, the plants that could survive through the frost, and how to preserve these food sources for the months ahead. While the ground was covered in snow, they could still find certain hardy plants that were capable of surviving the cold. Certain winter greens, such as sorrel and wintercress, grew in sheltered areas and could be harvested even in winter. These greens were important for providing fresh vitamins during the cold months when other food sources were limited. They would search for these greens in areas that were not as exposed to the wind, such as in sheltered river valleys, near rocks or under tree canopies. The Vikings knew which plants could tolerate the cold and still provide valuable nutrients, which was vital during the long, harsh winters. Given the scarcity of fresh food during the winter, numerous preservation methods were employed to ensure they could rely on their foraged food throughout the cold months. Drying was one of the most common and effective methods used to preserve food, especially during the summer and fall when fresh food was abundant. By removing the moisture from foods, drying helped prevent spoilage and extended the shelf life of various items. To dry fish and meat, the Vikings often built wooden drying racks or used lines strung between 2 points. These were often built outside in the fresh air, but protected from rain or direct sunlight. They also used smokehouses or smoke drying for both fish and meat. The food would be suspended inside the smokehouse, where it would be exposed to low, continuous heat from burning wood or peat, allowing it to dry while being infused with smoke. This process not only preserved the food, but also added flavor and antibacterial properties, preventing spoilage. Fermentation was another vital preservation technique used. Fermentation not only preserved foods, but also enhanced their nutritional value by producing beneficial bacteria. This method was often used for dairy, vegetables, and some meats. Sauerkraut, for example, was made by salting and fermenting cabbage in sealed containers. The Vikings would store the cabbage in wooden barrels, allowing it to ferment over several weeks to months. This preserved it for use during the winter months and provided a source of vitamin C, which helped prevent scurvy. Fish, particularly herring, would be packed in barrels with salt and allowed to ferment over time. This method was similar to how the Norse preserved fish today in certain regions of Scandinavia. Vikings kept milk-producing animals like cows, goats, and sheep, and fermented dairy products were common. Skyr, a yogurt-like dairy product, and cheese were made from milk and stored in cool, dry conditions. These dairy products were preserved for winter consumption and were a good source of protein and calcium. Salting was another common preservation method, particularly for fish and meat. Salt draws moisture out of the food, creating an environment inhospitable to bacteria, which helps to preserve the food for extended periods. After catching fish, they would be cleaned, salted, and packed tightly in barrels for storage. Salted herring, for example, could last for many months when kept in a cool, dry place. Larger cuts of meat or pieces of dried meat from other animals were also salted to preserve them for later use. Storage was just as important as the preservation method itself. Wooden barrels were essential for storing salted fish, pickled vegetables, and fermented foods. These barrels kept food secure as they could be sealed and transported easily. They were also commonly used for storing liquids like beer or mead. For pickling, drying, or storing grains, clay jars and pots were used. These containers were ideal for keeping small quantities of food and could be sealed with cloth or leather to keep them fresh for longer periods. Given the cold climate, the Vikings didn't need to invest in refrigeration, but they did take advantage of the cool, stable temperatures of the earth. In the winter, they would store their preserved foods in cool, dry places such as root cellars dug into the ground, which acted as natural refrigerators. Now we've covered the physical aspects of survival, but there's another crucial element: the Vikings' family dynamics. Unlike modern life, where people can often rely on supermarkets and individual efforts, these families worked together in every sense of the word. The survival of the family wasn't just about one person's strength, it was about collective action. Archaeological research shows that Viking communities were often built around the family unit. Each member of the family had a vital role to play. The men might go hunting or fishing, but the women would be responsible for maintaining the household, preserving food, weaving clothing, and ensuring the longhouse stayed warm. Children, even at a young age, were expected to help gather firewood, tend to animals, and learn valuable skills like weaving, cooking, or even hunting. In fact, women were often highly skilled craftsmen. They were not just wives or mothers, but equal partners in the survival of the household. Community and cooperation were crucial to survival. It wasn't just about individual families. Villages were often organized around shared resources, including hunting grounds, fishing spots, and food storage areas. Despite their rugged individualism, they understood the value of cooperation. Each member of the community had a role to play, and each family's survival depended on the survival of others. Whether it was sharing knowledge of where to find food or working together to build homes, the Viking way of life was rooted in cooperation, hard work, and mutual support. In spite of all the hardships they faced, the Vikings understood the importance of celebrating life. After all, survival isn't just about enduring hardship, it's about finding joy even in the darkest days. The longhouse hearths would burn bright with the warmth of family, laughter, and music as Vikings celebrated their strength, their unity, and the spirit of survival. So, how did the Vikings survive the harsh, cold climate? Through a combination of ingenuity, resourcefulness, and, most importantly, family cooperation. Their ability to work together, adapt to the environment, and use every resource at their disposal is what allowed them to thrive in one of the harshest climates on Earth. And that spirit of resilience lives on in the stories we tell today. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe for all things Viking.